Three, two, yes. And now we are live. So, as usual, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone and anyone watching live now or listening later to the podcast or watching the video. Thank you very much for being here. It's an absolute pleasure to be joined today by Dr. Goodwyn. Erik, thank you very much for being here.
I'm glad to be here.
So, my first question for you: you are an academic, you are a psychiatrist.
Mm-hmm.
You've got published work in the field of psychiatry.
Mm-hmm.
So, what madness possessed you to write a fantasy novel?
Well, that's a great question. I've had a passion for fantasy pretty much ever since I was a kid. I got the writing bug early, and I would scribble huge notes of stories that even in middle school, and that's never left me, even though my interests have kind of broadened out into what I'm doing now. I'm a psychiatrist, and I've done a lot of lectures and all over the place about dreams and Jungian psychology and archetypes and biological theory of the psyche and neuroscience, etc. But always in the background, there's been the love for fantasy, and I think that one of the biggest ideas that I think has pushed this forward for me is that I think that fantasy as a genre has the tendency to kind of fall into this idea of it's just all make believe. It's some imaginary stuff. It has no connection to reality, right? People talk a lot about how fantasy is escapism, for example, and even Tolkien talked about that.
Mm-hmm.
And now he had a pretty nuanced view of that. We can talk about that if you want, I guess. But I think what we tend not to see is that fantasy can have a very strong connection to quote reality because of its ability to express emotional reality through symbols. And because it's fantasy, I can use the symbols any way I want to, because I don't have to worry about physics or any of that kind of thing. I can say, there's magic and there's monsters and dragons and all that. And so if I'm going through something like a trauma, for example, and that's exactly what the psyche normally does, is in the process of dreaming, it'll create fantastical narratives, but they're not meaningless or random. And that's, I think, an idea that some people like to think about, is that dreams are just kind of random and meaningless, but that's not the case. We're processing when we're dreaming. We're processing emotions. And one of the ways we do that is by telling stories. So we'll tell these stories that are loaded with imagery and symbolism. Of course, the problem is that a lot of times we don't know, the symbols are created by the unconscious. And so we don't know exactly what the meaning of it was. And so we might scratch our heads over that. But, when you get into like dream science and psychoanalysis and all this kind of stuff, you can see that the themes are there. And once you recognize and you realize you shouldn't take it literally, you should take it more metaphorically, a lot of things make a lot more sense. In some of my writing, I talk about how if you're a complete loss at what a dream might mean, you can use something I call the dream hack, which is basically taking the context and the text of the dream and say, let's call it X, right? And put it into the sentence. You can say, my life is progressing as if X. So if I have a big decision in my life coming up, a lot of times in that situation, a person will dream about being at a crossroads, right? It's kind of a metaphor for how they are. Right. And so if I use that technique, I'll say it's as if I'm reaching a crossroads in my life. Oh, well, that makes a whole lot more sense. With fantasy, of course, you can have things like giants and monsters and fairy creatures and everything else as representations of emotional things that you're trying to deal with. So rather than, I guess the long story short is, rather than treat it as though it's pure escapism, which I'm not denying it can be, I think the best fantasy that's been written out there are ones where they go that extra step and they say, like The One Ring, for example. I'm a huge Tolkien fan. If you look at The One Ring and you say, what is that a symbol of? Well, you could talk about that all day, right? There's tons of symbolism in there, and it's based on reality. Like, it's based on real feelings that we have about temptation and power and valuing friendship over domination of others and all that kind of stuff. Where I think fantasy can go wrong is when it's just, oh, that's cool, let's throw that in there, and not a whole lot else put into it. And because it's fantasy, you can do that, right? So when you said in your other video, is there anything to do with fantasy other than let the Dark Lord win? I could feel that. Like, yeah, I can understand why somebody would say that, because there's so much stuff out there that's just, let's just, cook up random stuff and because it's cool and that's it. And it can be fun, but it doesn't have a whole lot of resonance with the soul. Nobody will be talking about it in, 75 years like we're still talking about Tolkien, or some of the other greats.
Yeah, I think I heard quoted somewhere, sometime, someplace, that art has got two main purposes, which is to educate and entertain. And if you can do both, obviously, you hit the jackpot. And sometimes art could just be for entertainment's sake.
Yeah.
Which, any movie or book or whatever. And if he's trying to educate or say something a bit more profound than just take you on an adventure, I think that's probably what you're referring to, isn't it? When you're trying to convey some deeper ideas than just the entertainment of elves slaying orcs.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And the people that don't get it are basically the ones that are kind of taking it literally at the surface level only. Like I remember back when Roger Ebert was before he died, he was very popular. He would pay lip service to the Lord of the Rings movies, but then he would say, well, this is all just really silly. But he clearly didn't understand what it was really about, and so this principle that I'm talking about of using fantasy to express emotional realities is a big part of what's behind the novel I wrote that you're reading now. And if part of the issue is that this symbol is that the psyche used, the symbols that the mind creates in order to process emotions, you might ask, like, why bother with all this metaphor, right? Why not just say it? Because a picture is worth 1,000 words. That's the short answer, right? And so if I can say it's as if this is happening, I can combine a lot of like the sensory motor feel and the emotional depth of a situation rather than just kind of listing off, a verbal description. See, and so that's why I think the mind uses imagery to depict our current life situation, because it's a more ancient type of language, for one. Like, it's pre-verbal. Like, I'm pretty sure at this point that animals probably think in images. Well, I should say other animals, right? Because we're animals.
Yeah.
We also have language that we pile on top of it, but the mistake is to think that's all there is. But of course, most of our communication is nonverbal, right? Well, that's how the mind is operating when you're in that kind of dream state, and you can drift into that even awake, in hypnotic states, for example, or trance states, or entheogens, or all kinds of stuff like that can evoke that.
The thing is that talking to you, like, we could take the conversation in many ways, and we've got limited time because I could ask you so much about psychiatry and all that, and so just very quickly then, because I want to stick more to the writing and the books and everything.
Okay.
Just very quickly, so does every dream have meaning? Everything we dream of, is it trying to tell us something about ourselves?
Fantastic question. I would say the answer to that is usually.
Okay.
Usually, right? So it depends on what you're going through. So,
like, I'll tell you, one of my recurring dreams is to, like, I finished university over 20 years ago. Every now and then, I still wake up dreaming that I got a piece of an essay to hand in, like I've got a deadline at university, and I wake up all stressed, like, oh my God, I'm gonna finish that. And then it's like, whoa, okay, no, that I left uni 20 years ago. Like, no, I'm not at that stage. So clearly that's telling me something, right?
Yeah.
I need to pay my bills or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, and that's usually what it is. Again, if you dream hack it, right? You say, well, it's as if I've got an assignment at university that it's due that I'm not paying attention to. I would suggest in that instance that, without having any other context, is to say, the mind is saying there's something that you're not paying attention to that you probably need to, and it right now feels like that situation, right? So dreams they will use images from the past, but it's always about what's going on right now, because the mind doesn't have a lot of time to just endlessly, stay in the past. And there is one exception to that, and that's going to be your severe post-traumatic stress dreams, kind of like what Liam has in my book. He starts off with that. In that instance, your mind is trying desperately to make sense and to process the trauma, but it's stuck. And it's as if you're reliving it every day. Boom, there you are. And that's why they do that, see? Now, if you are in the midst of a lot of emotional, stressful things going on, your dreams will be much more narrow in focus, and they'll be much more meaningful because they'll be streamlined towards those emotional concerns. Like the brain knows the brain uses emotion as the litmus test. Like if there's a lot of emotion involved, I'm going to focus a lot of energy processing it. If there's not, meh. Right. So the paradox then is when I'm working with patients, for example, as they get better, their dreams get harder to interpret because they're more expansive and playful. They're actually just sort of saying, yeah, what happens if I throw this into that? Let's see what happens there. So in those instances, they don't quite necessarily have as deep or profound a meaning. But that's a good sign, right? You want your brain to be in playful exploration mode rather than like zeroing in on this super important thing. But the good news is if you are, those dreams are a lot easier to interpret because the symbols used are going to be very commonly found and archetypal in some cases. If it's a very common like phase of life thing, like, growing up and moving away from the parents, finding your own way in the world, you're going to have a lot of these sort of initiation type dreams where you have to go to the tribe and you have to, engage with the rituals and all that kind of stuff. You'll have that kind of stuff typically, or even going to psychotherapy. That's another instance. And I've woven a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, because I've got like, oh my God, I'm going to ask you about this and then this and my mind is. So I'm assuming that the writing of King of the Forgotten Darkness, the book that I'm reading now, you're deriving some of your experience as a practicing psychiatrist into the book.
Yes.
Now, is it just like a general thing over your years of experience, or is it a particular patient or one or two particular patients that you've sort of molded into this generic story?
Hold on. I gotta.
Sure.
Yeah. Hello.
Oh, you can deactivate the audio if you want.
Yes.
This is the problem of being live. Hopefully.
Yes. Okay, we can do that. No problem. Sorry about that.
No worries. The risk of being live at work.
Here we are. So, what was the question?
I was asking you about whether your book is influenced by just your general years of experience, or have you zeroed in on 2 or 3 particular cases to influence the writing?
I'd say it's a little bit of both. So over the years, I've looked a lot into creative writing. That's one of the things that I found out about writing in fiction, that for me, anyway, is a lot harder than writing nonfiction. Writing nonfiction, you come up with theories, you write it down, you're done. It doesn't have to be entertaining. No, it doesn't have to be interesting. Yeah. That's the hard part, right? So, and what I've learned from the reams of stuff that I've read about creative writing is that when you're working on characters, for example, you want to try to make it as real as possible, but try not to base it on one person, right? Because then that one person will find you and they'll be like, that's supposed to be me, isn't it? Yeah. Like Citizen Kane, right? And all the trouble he got into for that. So there are elements of real people spread about the various characters, but a lot of it is just sort of general principles, and like really kind of deep thematic things that I have found to be true over the years. And if I were to just say them, right? I would lose a whole lot of the impact of the message. It's kind of like if you ask a dancer like what their dance meant, and they come back at you, well, if I could just tell you that, I wouldn't need to dance it, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the same thing when it comes to dreams and fiction, especially fantasy fiction, when it's done well, I think. If it's not just, oh, this is cool, let's throw it in there.
Okay.
Right. So yeah, that was definitely a part of it. I looked into especially the trauma stuff that Liam deals with. That's all pretty clinical.
Right. And then,
but it is taken next to the next level because it is a fantasy, and so I can use some of that stuff and encounter it more literally. So like in a traumatic person dealing with trauma dreams, they might run into a scary character in the dream. Well, in a fantasy, that character can walk around in flesh and blood and threaten you with swords and stuff like that, so it makes it more intense, but it is kind of like an extended dream.
So a bit of a more light question before we get it sort of more in depth with some stuff. So I don't know how this works for your more academic published works. Do you also have an agent, or do you submit directly to a specific publisher that specializes in academic publishing or whatever? Because what I'm trying to get at is, have you got an agent that knew you as, Erik, you're the dreams guy, what are you doing with a fantasy book now? Did you have that kind of moment?
Well, there aren't a whole lot of agents out there that do that crossover type stuff. With my academic work, I just submit directly to the publisher at this point, because I've got a pretty good relationship with them. I never did end up needing an agent there. But academic writing, the pool of people submitting stuff is way smaller. Yeah. So the competition is, you've got to be good. You've got to be able to pass muster as a scholar, which is not easy. But that's where all the work is. And in fiction, not only do you have to have an excellent story, but then you've got to be competing with all these other people that have pretty good stories too. And right now, the way that the market is, it's very geared towards this person is an established name. They can pretty much write whatever they want. Like Brandon, you mentioned Brandon Sanderson before, where you started recording. I think he could write a book of recipes and people would go bonkers over it,
Yep.
At this point. So it's really tough for debut authors. And these people can write these 900-page doorstops, and publishers are, yeah, that's great. If you're a debut author, though, if it's over 100,000 words, get lost.
Yeah, because I heard recently that apparently there is this pressure coming from publishers to write shorter books, which in fantasy fiction is a little bit complicated because you got all that world building to deal with. Yeah. Is that something you've encountered with this book?
Oh, definitely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, I really had to find the right balance. Now, I'm not a huge, I have read Malazan. I've read many of them. And I've read Sanderson, and those are great works. Those are coming from established authors that got their start in the 90s. So they can write anything they want, and they're going to be loved. But for my book, I had to strike the balance between. I've got a huge amount of world building for this. I don't know if you can tell from reading it, but there's a boatload of stuff that I'm not saying in there. That's the tip of the iceberg is all I could really afford to throw in there. And in a way, I'm actually okay with that, because sometimes I feel like fantasy authors kind of get into world building porn, right? And they just go bonkers with it. And it's like, can we just get on with the story, whatever it is, like, and I say that as a lover of fantasy in the sense that I love getting immersed in all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, it's like, okay, we get it. You've done your homework. You've created all this stuff. So yeah, I thought, well, this will give me an opportunity to try to strike as good of a balance between focusing, like laser focusing on the actual narrative at hand, but just including enough stuff going on in the background to give the reader the strong impression that there's a whole lot more going on there that I can explore later, maybe someday if there's more books, which I hope there will be. But
okay. And then something you sort of briefly mentioned in passing before, but you talked about archetypes, and you sort of, I don't know if this is going to come across a little bit weird, like you identify yourself as a Jungian
Yeah.
So those young archetypes,
Mm-hmm.
they do exist for a reason, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
But in conversations I've had in the past, are they a universal archetype or are they a specific to Western culture?
um, yeah. So how long you got, right? That's
Well,
that is a long question to answer, but I'll try to narrow it down. The first thing I would say about that is that there's many different theories of archetypes out there. One of the challenges is that Jung, when he developed his idea, was kind of all over the place, and it was hard to pin him down exactly on what he was talking about necessarily. So, given that, I a lot of what my academic writing is on the biological theory, which is to say, yes, we're looking at universals. Now, that said, that doesn't mean there's no cultural elements in there. Of course, there is. But characters like the wise man in the woods and, the hero's journey, right? That gets tossed
mhm,
around all the time.
mhm.
I think people beat that to death a little bit because that's really more Joseph Campbell
Yeah.
than Jung. And Campbell has his critics, and I don't want to get too deep into that. And I don't think he was entirely wrong necessarily, but it's a lot of times it's a very reductive way of looking at it. So, but just to give you an example, I do believe that a lot of especially my more recent academic work is talking about how we have this kind of innate symbol language that we use, and it's based really on just universal elements of the physical body. For example,
Mhm.
um, you can find metaphors equating anger with heat in languages all over the world. And I don't think it's a coincidence that physiologically, when we get angry, our temperature goes up, right? Our skin
Mhm.
flushes and we feel the warmth. And so it's not like it takes a unique poetic genius to come up with that metaphor, right? Anybody from anywhere, if you grew up on Mars, you could still make that, connection and use it to create other metaphors.
Mhm.
So there's a whole list of these that I talk about in my academic work, like the connection between, this was a big one in fantasy, between darkness and danger. But, why is it the Dark Lord? Why isn't it the pink polka dotted Lord?
Yeah.
Right? It's always the Dark Lord, the
Yeah.
dark this, the dark that. Well, because as humans, right, we have lousy night vision,
Yeah.
even though we're mammals, but we're diurnal, right? So we're vulnerable in times of darkness, we're clumsier, all that kind of stuff. And so very early on, any human, regardless of culture, is going to make that connection. So if you combine all of those, like there's a big long list that I've compiled so far. That's the innate kind of alphabet that we have, that we use to create symbols for dreams and other spontaneous thoughts. That they transcend languages and cultures. Anybody could understand what you're talking about here, as long as they understood it was a metaphor.
Yeah.
Right. So in that sense, yes, universal, biologically based, probably, in the genome somewhere.
Okay. No,
Yeah.
and I'm guessing that there are some. We'll I think have some innate fears, possibly born out of evolution, isn't it? We're all, I think, naturally afraid of snakes,
Yeah.
spiders,
Yep.
things like that, isn't it? Which
Mhm.
it's natural because what, it's been genetically coded throughout
Yeah.
evolution.
That's basically it. Like we, and this goes before Homo sapiens. All primates except lemurs from Madagascar are afraid of snakes. And human societies have mythologies about giant snakes, even in cultures where there are no snakes in the natural environment. They have like giant evils, but it's the same
Mm.
thing, and we put a lot of importance. Now, they're not always evil, really, but they are definitely something not to be ignored. And that probably, again, relates to our evolutionary, biology, our psychology, in that snakes were a natural, a danger to humans. And so we have innate mechanisms that say, oh, there's a snake there. You can see this in studies where they show people pictures of like flowers with snakes kind of snuck in there,
Hmm.
and check to see how fast it takes them to find the snakes. And then do
Right.
it the other way around. Have a bunch of snakes where I'm trying to find flowers. They can't do that anywhere near as easily. right? So we have these mechanisms that cue in on snakes and spiders and
Okay.
color red. I talk a lot about this in my book, The Neurobiology of the Gods. That's one of my first books that I wrote.
All right.
There's a
Okay.
lot of cool stuff in there.
And then, so I think I can remember. I think we were talking a little bit before going live, but I said, well, you've addressed that. I don't think there's a lot left to do in fantasy other than making the Dark Lord win. I think the whole grimdark genre, is this an attempt at deconstructing those Jungian archetypes? I'm thinking, if you've read the First Lord trilogy
I have.
by Joe Abercrombie, that first trilogy,
Mhm.
I didn't understand it at first. I needed a bit more time to talk to people and process it. But I'm thinking about the figure of Bayas, the wizard there. He's like your anti-Gandalf. He's like an asshole Gandalf sort of thing. Was that a necessary thing to do?
That's a good question. I mean, I really enjoyed that trilogy, but at the same time, I did ask myself, like, what is the point of this? Like, why are we doing this? Is it just, let's take all the tropes and then twist them on their head? Why? If that's, like, why do that? Because it's interesting or fun? I think after thinking about it, though, he was trying to say something. He was trying to say something about how difficult it is to avoid corruption. And he was making a lot of, I think, fairly obvious statements about how people use political institutions, and for their own ends, and a lot of stuff about greed, So he's really kind of engaging with a lot of the same stuff that Tolkien was, only he flips it upside down. The effect there, though, is to, in some ways, remove any sort of hope that it's ever going to be fixed, and that's perhaps where he differs most strongly. I'm pretty sure Tolkien would not have enjoyed
No,
he didn't like Dune, right? We know that much. And Dune has the same kind of, I mean, it's not, this whole grimdark thing is not new, right? I think Dune is pretty grimdark. I don't know if you've read any of those, but
I've read the first Dune book. Yeah.
Okay. They get grimmer and darker and way weirder in the series.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So
no, I checked out of that series after the first book, but
sorry.
Go on.
No, it's fine. But that is a good question. I have noticed too, I think along with you, that the grimdark thing is super popular right now. Game of Thrones, for example, and there is a very fine line for me in what would be labeled as grimdark in terms of having lots of gray characters and lots of questionable motives. There's a difference, I think, between that and something that is just flat out nihilistic, where everybody's just out for their own ends and it's nothing but backstabbing and intrigue and all that kind of. I can't get into that. I don't like that very much. I don't understand what the point of it is. To me, it's like a dream that has no purpose or no, aim. When dreams really are always aiming toward adaptation and homeostasis, trying to correct things that have gone wrong, trying to mend wounds. There's this natural process that goes on within the mind. So, in a way, we were kind of in the same boat when the first Star Wars movie came out. There was a lot of kind of grimdark stuff, The Godfather, and Apocalypse Now came out a little bit afterwards, but it was still in that same vein of, we're going to talk about how crappy everything is and how crappy people are. And then Star Wars comes along and says, hey, maybe there's something good that can happen, if we believe in the Force and all that kind of stuff, And it went crazy. It went absolutely crazy. I think people were craving that. So you've got to have the balance.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get into that discussion again about whether A Song of Ice and Fire is grimdark or not, because I think there are still characters that are motivated by traditionally, heroic deeds and wanting to do good, and
that's fair,
and so on. And I never thought about The Godfather as being grimdark, to be honest. I think what it manages to do very well is to actually make us sympathize with people that are intrinsically evil, I suppose.
Yeah.
But that's a very interesting take.
Yeah.
So So, I mean, you've already mentioned Tolkien, but in terms of your writing, what fantasy authors do you think have sort of, or do you take inspiration from? Because, like you said, writing for academics and writing fiction, totally different.
Yeah. Well, in a way, I've tried to do kind of what Tolkien did himself, which was dive into the original mythology. So I've read a lot of that, like the Eddas and the Irish sagas and all that folklore, really old fantasy, right? really old fantasy, the original OG fantasy fiction. Right? Although of more recent stuff, I did like the Harry Potter series, and I do like the Malazan series, even though it's very close to kind of the grimdark aesthetic too. Yeah. And again, with Malazan, I'm not really sure exactly what he's doing, like why, but I haven't reached the end of the series yet either, so I'm open to see where it goes. But I've you asked off off camera earlier, like why can't we have stuff about giants and fairy creatures and all that? And that was a deliberate choice on my part to kind of go back to that kind of stuff, because I feel like there's still some life left in it. Maybe if only because hardly anybody else is doing that anymore. There's a lot of like fae, stuff out there that's especially in the romantasy subgenre. And it's eye-rolling and cringy to me, but whatever. It's popular for whatever it's worth. But that's not fairy creatures. That's not like spirits of the forest. It's it's like sexy vampire stuff. It's kind of what that is.
No. I only found out about that term romantasy a few weeks ago when I interviewed Sanderson's agent, Joshua Bilmes.
Yeah, I saw that one.
And then it reminded me when my then girlfriend, now wife, made me sit through True Blood. Like, I can't stand sexy vampires. Like, it really is not. It's not cool at all. It's not for me.
Man, not for me either. I'm not into that.
Yeah, and so, is that your phone again? Go for it. Yeah, never mind.
Hello. All right. Yeah, I can do that. All right. Thanks. Sorry.
No worries at all.
Today, of course, all days I get all kinds of calls.
Nah, never mind. Anyway. So, is this just like a one-off foray into fantasy? Is your idea to carry on building or expanding on these characters or this world that you've created?
Yes, that's the short answer.
Okay, all right.
I wrote it as a standalone because, again, in the current climate, debut fantasy authors, they don't want to hear that you've got 5 books planned or any of that stuff. Right? Just tell one good story and then talk to me later. That's kind of the attitude. So it is written as a standalone, but there's more that can be said.
Okay. Yeah, and I think what you mentioned about going to the OG fantasy, I picked on that while reading your book, because naming conventions and toponymics they remind me of like Scotland, basically. There's and sort of Latin names for Britain and things like that. And I was going somewhere else with this, but I've literally just lost my train of thought, which is deeply embarrassing. Great.
Well, I went back to folklore, history about the Celts, and then I've kind of shook it up a little bit, gave it some fantasy flavor, put it in a little bit different context. It's not something, I know there's lots of Eurocentric so-called fantasy out there, but I tried to give it a different spin.
Right.
And there are other, in Arantir, there's this culture, but there's a bunch of others that are inspired by other cultures all over the world. But I just didn't get into it because it's not part of this particular story. Maybe
Okay.
future book I can.
So that's
You
it.
remember your question?
I just remember. No,
Okay.
it's because you got to explain this to me, right? And this is silly, something that's been bugging me, right?
Okay.
You've created a fantasy world. It's great, and I quite like that whole. And you're saying a lot about current society, to be honest, but we can unpick that later.
Yeah.
It's a fantasy world, but they're drinking Jameson's whiskey. What's going on there? Why are they drinking Jameson's whiskey? Like when I read that, I was like, what?
Well, I think as George Lucas once put it, some things you just put in there for whimsy. Now, Midworld, the world where we start off, is this world in the future.
Yeah,
right?
no. Yeah.
Right, so they do mention things that exist in this world, like Jameson, right? I'm just a big fan of Jameson, so I threw it in there. I wanted to give it a label in the name.
Fantastic.
And of course, Arantir is a completely fantastical world, and so, but as you know, you've no doubt learned at this point, there's been, and this I mentioned this at the very beginning of the book, that there's always been these sort of gateways between the two worlds. Only now most of them are closed. Mm-hmm. So that's one way in which this so-called real world could have somehow bled into the other world and back and forth across the ages.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense.
No, it does. And I think you make a lot of fine observations about potentially where our current society may be leading into.
Yeah.
And that's a bit grimdark, like the society you present in Midworld. There's obviously a commentary on AI, and that's one way the conversation could go. Mm-hmm. But I also found possibly more interesting that you've got these sort of automatic dispensers of medication, mm-hmm. This sort of I don't know what kind of medication is it? Is it like a?
Well, it's basically, I asked myself, at some point neuroscience will get advanced enough to where we can create a drug like this. I don't think that it's unrealistic at all. We're pretty far from it now. We'd have to do something that was able to manipulate epigenetic, genomic shifts in the brain and stuff like that. But it's within the realm of possibility. Meaning that we could take a pill that eliminated. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, sorry to interrupt. It was just an insight for anyone listening that obviously hasn't read the book. It's some kind of make you happy drug, isn't it? Like any problem you've got, you can just go to these dispensers, like, on the street, put a few coins, and get this drug that is gonna make you.
It's freely distributed.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You can get it for free. And at one point, Liam walks into a dispenser that says, "Sign up for 6-month injections," and you can just get it constantly. Because one of the things that motivated me to write this was the question of suffering. And if we were able to technologically get to the point where we could eliminate all suffering, what would that really look like? Like, what would that do? So hopefully that's intriguing enough to get people to, check it out and pre-order it. Because that's one of the themes that I'm talking about here. And Arantir, of course, represents a place where none of that crap works. And so you go in there and you've got to accept pain and death and suffering and gore and all kinds of stuff that we've been trying to avoid since the dawn of humanity. But the question really at play here is, we've been trying to avoid that and control our environment for our whole existence. Well, what happens if we win? If we succeed, then what? And the consequence of that could be quite grimdark, but I'll let you read on and see what you think I think of it.
And you've also got something to say about AI, and it's something I've discussed in the channel with another author, Jared Michaud, when he came on, and we kind of were strangely on the same page, because AI seems to be this devil thing that any creative type at the moment is going to sort of come to your house with pitchforks and torches if you even defend AI.
That is and I definitely take a few pot shots at AI used in that way in this book. Funny enough, I've been recently looking for artists to come up with character paintings for the novel, for promotional materials, And some of them now are using AI and then modifying it. Like they'll use the AI to create a basic thing, and then they use Photoshop to give it their own spin. Like, what is that? Is that AI or is it not? It's kind of a hybrid, so I don't even know where that's going. But in mid-world, we've gotten to the point where AI is just so good that you don't need anything like that. And so AI creates all of our entertainments, and one of the main characters, of course, Mia, is an artist who can't help but create art anyway. And her development is very dependent on that challenge.
I think, because I think whatever anyone might think about AI, it's one of those things that is here to stay, and we just need to learn to use the technology, isn't it?
I agree. It's not. I'm not, getting on a soapbox about it. I try not to do any of that sort of preachiness in my fiction writing, because I find it tiresome.
No, but something that both, particularly Jared, brought up to my attention when we were discussing the impact of AI, is that he said that, again, something that is innate to us is that we have an appreciation for crafts. We will value something that has been handcrafted over anything that has been mass produced. So we can have AI generating images. We may be able to create our own Superman comics and do that sort of thing. But I think we will always value the craft of an artist that can draw and write a comic by himself or a team of two, or whether it is making beer or a pair of shoes or whatever it is.
Yeah, and isn't that interesting that we have an inherent love for imperfection, right? And that could potentially be a saving grace in the end. Something to think about, and I do encounter that theme in this book too.
Yeah, absolutely. I almost feel I'm not going to say that your book is a bit of a bait and switch, but I think you're very clearly talking about some things while we are in Midworld, and then when we travel across to Erranty, you're talking about other things, and I'm assuming that was obviously the intention, and whether it allows you to talk about different things that you wouldn't be able to do if you stuck to just a pure fantasy world.
Right. Yeah, I think I understand what you're talking about. Now, of course, you haven't finished it yet.
Nope.
So no. So I don't want to spoil any endings, but the Midworld thing comes up later. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
The stuff that I raised up there later, and it's maybe not where you think it's going.
So long as you don't tell me that it was all a dream. He wakes up and it was all a dream.
No, it is that. I did have an earlier version of this book where it was like that, and the feedback I got from it was no.
Literally, just
yes, it was like letters. I hate this. I'm like, okay, all right, and they were right. They were absolutely right, and that was a great feedback that I took from
right.
from that.
So on a more personal level, you've obviously got you practice. You're at a hospital right now. You do some teach some courses at different institutions in the US. You do conferences, all that sort of stuff. How are you going to manage to juggle the marketing sales hat that you need to put on once you finish your book that is coming out next year? Is it?
Yeah. I don't know. Sheer force of will. I have no idea. I'm just trying to do it the best I can. I get that question actually a lot because people will say, like, how do you have time to write all this stuff and you get a full-time job and blah, 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 blah. And it's like, I don't know. I don't know what to tell them. I don't watch a lot of TV, maybe. I don't know. But even that's not entirely true. I still, watch some shows here and there. But the fiction side of it is a labor of love, right? I'm always thinking about it if I'm not working on it. So it's always in the background, churning. So, and the marketing, it's a huge learning curve, like how to do that. And thankfully, the publisher's helping me out with that, as they're supposed to,
Yeah,
But
yeah.
but now in this current market, right, the most of the time your writers are expected, especially new ones, to do a lot of their own marketing. They got to develop a platform, you've got to get your name out there and do the best you can with that. So I was already kind of doing that anyway with my scholarly stuff. So I've just sort of said, hey, there's a connection here between the scholarly stuff I'm doing and fiction writing. And I'm not the first one to do that actually either. There's um, other Jungians actually. It's probably more common amongst Jungians than it is among any other sorts of psychiatrists, but because of their connection with story and myth and legend. But there are some that like write history novels. Susan Rowland, for example, will get an endorsement for my book. And there's others that are like professors of screenwriting and all that kind of stuff. So
Okay.
they figured out a way to do it. I guess I can.
Yeah, and just because I am aware that I'm very grateful for your time, that we're running a bit of a limited time. Did you ever watch Frasier, the TV show?
I've seen one or two episodes.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you know the basic premise of it?
Yeah, he's a psychiatrist.
Yeah, he's a Freudian psychiatrist. He's got a radio show.
Yeah.
And in one of the episodes, his brother has to take over the show because he's going on holidays or something like that. And when the brother gets on the show, he goes, well, I'm not a Freudian, I'm a Jungian, so we're not going to blame mom and dad here. We're going to take ownership of it. Is that basically the main difference between the two schools of thought?
Yeah, I think maybe at one time, right? The Freudians have moved on and progressed into new territory.
Right. Okay.
I mean, obviously they still focus a lot on the parental experiences and early experiences. A lot of schools of psychotherapy do that. Funny enough is that joke is kind of an expression of how things were more in that time frame, like late 90s, early 2000s. I think really over the last 20 years, we've seen a whole lot more collaboration in psychoanalytic schools. There's not quite so many, name brand, like, oh, I'm this kind, and therefore I'm not going to talk to you and all that kind of crap. There's a whole lot more talking across the aisle, as it were, which I think is good. I think it's good.
Yeah, I mean, there must be there must be no value in adhering strictly to like defending one school of thought, almost as if it's a religion, isn't it?
Yeah, it's academic tribalism. It's silly. Yeah.
And then final thing, because I remember today. Have you read this book? It's called The Interpretation of Murder.
No, I have not.
So it's meant to be 1909. So Sigmund Freud arrives in New York, and there's a murder, and this whole psychiatry thing going on in the background of basically just a murder mystery.
Okay.
No, I think it's just one of those sort of books that you might pick up at an airport or a train station.
Yeah.
But, it's got that sort of background going on.
Yeah, I just recently watched Freud's Last Session. It's a movie, actually. It's a speculation about what would happen if Freud met C.S. Lewis.
Oh,
right. And it was from one of the universities I used to work at full time at University of Louisville. One of my colleagues said, "Hey, can you come in and watch this with the residents, and we can have a discussion about it?" And I was like, "Okay, if it was Jung and Tolkien, I would know a whole lot more to talk about." But I don't, they didn't make a movie about that.
Well, that's an idea for your next book.
There you go.
There you go. And then finally, for my own, I think I know the difference, but I'm sure you get asked this a lot by people, stupid people like me. The difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist.
The main difference is that a psychiatrist is a medical doctor, a physician. So we have to go to medical school, and then we get 4 years of residency training in psychiatry. So we learn psychotherapy and we learn a lot of psychology, but it's kind of like 4 years of post-grad training compared to. So now psychologists have post-grad training institutions also that they can do. The other piece of it is that as psychiatry, you have to take care of the medical side a lot, and we prescribe medications too. So that's another difference, is the medical piece.
So is psychology more sort of like behavior correction kind of therapy, whereas with psychiatry you go as a more clinical, like there's something evidently sort of physiologically wrong with the patient?
That's broadly true, yeah. It's mainly like the psychologists are more focused on psychological testing and psychotherapy techniques and things like that, and psychiatrists can be involved in that kind of stuff, but we focus more on like the medication management and that kind of thing. But there's also therapy involved there too. And of course, in the psychoanalytic traditions, if you're talking about Freud and Jung and Adler and Bion and all those guys, they started out as psychiatrists. So there's still that tradition there, that connection there.
Okay, all right. And maybe just to wrap things up, if you could let people know where they can find your book, your works, any social media you may want to plug. Let's go ahead.
Well, so I've got my YouTube channels, The Imaginarium. I can send the links. You can put them on the description, I suppose.
Yeah, we'll do.
King of the Forgotten Darkness is available for pre-order through Amazon UK right now. The publisher's telling me that they start there because they're based there. Collective Ink is based there, Roundfire Books, and they'll be adding more over the next few weeks. So if you don't want to buy from them, you can just wait around. It'll change. But I'll give the link there to the publisher, and then from there you can pre-order it if you want to. And also there's my website, erikgoodwyn.com. That'll link you to everything else. And if you sign up on the newsletter, then you'll get all the updates.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I've actually checked out a couple of videos on your channel on The Imaginarium where you talk about, sort of day-to-day sort of things that people can do to sort of manage their own. I don't want to say mental health, but sort of awareness.
Well, call that segment Mental Health Mondays. So
there you go. Fantastic. Erik, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for joining me this afternoon, slash evening. And if I could take you up on, or if I could steal some more of your time in the future to just talk about psychiatry, mental health, that would be awesome.
Right. As long as there's Gulendrock involved.
Okay. Well, you see,
I'm kidding. I love
Gulendrock. No. Oh, of course. I'll actually recommend, if you can ever do it. I've actually stopped drinking. I stopped drinking 6 months ago. I had some relatively serious health issues. So,
nothing wrong with that.
No. But oh man, do I miss it? Luckily, I had time to take a trip to Belgium, and I took a week-long trip to Belgium a couple of years ago. Got a friend who lives there, and we visited the abbeys where the Trappist monks brew their own beer, and you can only buy that beer on site.
Wow.
There. And it's a trip I would recommend any beer lover because it is truly fantastic.
Yeah. Awesome. I might have to do that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much once again.
They knew their way around beer.
Yeah. I'll try. Anyway, thanks again. Thank you, anyone that was watching before or listening later. Take lots and lots of care, and we'll see you soon.
All right. Bye, folks.
And again, this takes a couple